The first time Wade Dutton saw the apple slices spread across the canvas tarp pinned to the cabin roof, he laughed the way men do when they've decided something is beneath them but can't quite look away. He stood outside Ezra Hollis's general store on the main stretch of Cedar Bluff, Montana, one hand shielding his eyes against the June glare, the other pointing up at the eastern slope where Eleanor Marsh moved in slow, deliberate circles across her property like a woman performing some private ritual that had nothing to do with the rest of the world. The apple slices caught the morning sun and threw it back in small, scattered flashes, gold coins spread on a dark canvas, each one a judgment that Dutton couldn't read and so chose to mock. "You see what that woman's doing now?" His voice carried the length of the porch aimed at Hollis, who had stepped out to sweep dust off his boards. "Drying food in the sun like she's trying to cure leather. Thinks winter's going to come in July and steal her soul." Ezra Hollis squinted up at the ridge. He was a careful man, the kind who wrote everything in ledgers and remembered every transaction, and what he saw on that hillside made him shake his head with something between pity and disbelief. Lord have mercy, Eleanor Marsh has finally gone soft in the head. What neither man understood, watching from the comfort of a town that had never once gone hungry, was that Eleanor Marsh had not gone soft anywhere. She had gone hard in every direction that mattered. She was 42 years old. Her hair had turned gray at the temples in the years since she buried her family, and her hands had long forgotten how to be soft. There was a time not so distant when those same hands had ladled soup for sick neighbors, braided hair for young brides on their wedding mornings, held the trembling fingers of new mothers who didn't yet know what they were doing. Eleanor had been the kind of woman a community leaned on without realizing how much weight it was putting on one person. She ran the quilting circles. She knew which herbs brought fever down and which ones called it up. She had once spent an entire afternoon mending boots for a man too proud to ask his own wife for help, and she had done it without comment because she understood that pride was sometimes all a person had left. But that was before December of 1883, before the blizzard that did not announce itself, before 3 graves in frozen earth. She rarely came into town that summer of 1887. When she did not buy coffee or sugar or the small comforts that other households considered necessities. She bought salt. So much salt that Ezra Hollis joked he might as well hang a tannery sign above his door, and Eleanor paid him in silver coins and walked out without reaction because she had stopped spending energy on other people's opinions somewhere around the 2nd year after Caleb died. The boots she left in the dust going out were the same ones she wore coming in, and no one bothered to follow their prints up toward the ridge. What no one considered was that Hollis kept a record of every transaction in his ledger with the precision of a man who trusted paper more than memory, and that Wade Dutton shared morning coffee at that same counter most days. 2 small facts that would travel uphill to the wrong ears before summer ended. To understand why she worked the way she worked that summer, the obsessive dawn-to-dusk labor that the valley found so strange and so easy to ridicule, you had to understand what she had survived. And most of Cedar Bluff did not want to understand. It was easier to call her eccentric, easier to call her touched, easier to stand on a porch in June warmth and point at a woman drying fruit and feel the comfortable superiority of people who have never been forced to reckon with how thin the margin actually is. Caleb Marsh had been the finest carpenter in 3 counties when he was alive, a man with hands calloused from labor, but gentle enough that Eleanor never once felt the roughness when he reached for her. He had built their cabin himself on a stretch of land on the eastern slope of Cedar Bluff Ridge, the place they had chosen together because it caught the morning light, and because Caleb said the soil felt right when he pressed his palm against it. He carved their initials into the doorframe the day they moved in E&C, inside a rough oval, and every time Eleanor passed through that door in the years since she ran her thumb over the letters without thinking about it, the way you touch a scar that has become so familiar, it no longer hurts, or so you tell yourself. She had met him in Missouri, married him in a small whitewashed church with wildflowers pinned into her hair because she had not been able to afford anything more formal and had not wanted anything more formal anyway. She had followed him west without a moment's hesitation, and when their first son was born on the trail during a thunderstorm so violent it shook the wagon like a toy, she had held the baby in the rocking dark and felt something settle permanently into place inside her. She named him James. He came into the world yelling, which Caleb said was a good sign. Their second son, Henry, arrived this spring after they finished the cabin on a morning so still and bright It seemed designed to make the world look easier than it was. He was a quieter child than his brother from the first hour, watchful, serious with Caleb's eyes, and his father's habit of observing before speaking. For 5 years, the four of them built a life on that ridge that Eleanor had not known she was capable of wanting so completely. Caleb would come home from his workshop with sawdust in his beard, and the boys would run at him from the porch, climbing his legs like young animals claiming territory. And Eleanor would watch from the doorway with a fullness in her chest that sometimes frightened her because she had grown up understanding that anything this good was being stored up against a future debt. She had been right. The blizzard arrived on a December night when the sky had been entirely clear just hours before. That was the cruelest part in some ways, not the storm itself, but the false sky that preceded it, calm and star-scattered, offering no warning to anyone who did not know how to read the land. By the first morning, 3 feet of snow had buried the valley. By evening, it was even still falling. The temperature dropped to places a thermometer in Cedar Bluff had never recorded. Caleb went out for firewood on the first day, convinced he could reach the woodpile, and returned before the worst of it hit. He came back through the door more dead than alive, his feet black with frostbite that never fully healed, and by the 5th day, they had burned every piece of furniture in the cabin to stay warm. The chairs first, then the table Caleb had built for their second anniversary, the one with the small gouge on the left leg where James had once dropped a hammer. Then the bookshelf that held Eleanor's collection of poetry, those slim volumes she had carried all the way from Missouri in a canvas bag that had survived the trail crossing and 2 hard winters and deserved a better end. Food ran out on the 12th day. Half a sack of oats was all that remained, and Eleanor stretched it the way you stretch anything when you understand that the alternative is the end of everything thinner. Almost nothing and then nothing. She gave her portions to the boys, telling them she wasn't hungry, watching their eyes grow larger as their faces grew smaller. Henry developed a cough on the 15th day. It was wet and rattling and came from somewhere deep in his small chest, the kind of cough that Eleanor recognized from nursing other people's children and had never wanted to hear from her own. James was 7 years old and already trying to be the man of the house. He sat beside his brother every hour and told stories about summer, the creek where they caught frogs, the meadow full of wildflowers, the tree fort their father had promised to build when the thaw came. Eleanor would listen from across the room and feel her heart fracturing in a way that left no visible damage on the outside, because grief that deep never marks the surface. It goes straight to the foundation. Caleb could not get out of bed by the 18th day. His lungs had taken damage from that first desperate trip to the woodpile frost and working silently the way the worst injuries always work. He gripped Eleanor's hand with fingers that had lost all color, and his voice when it came was already far away. Save the boys, whatever it takes, don't give up. He died that night. The rattle of his last breath was a sound that found its way into Eleanor's nightmares for years afterward and never fully left. She did not have time to grieve. She told herself that then, and she believed it, and it was true, but it was also the story she had needed in order to keep moving. Henry went first 3 days after his father, his small body simply stopping the way a fire stops when the last fuel is gone. Eleanor held him and rocked him and sang the lullaby she had sung since the night he was born, and she refused to put him down for a very long time because she understood that putting him down was the final acknowledgement of something she was not ready to acknowledge. James lasted 1 more day. He looked at her with eyes far too old for a 7-year-old's face and said what she never forgot and never stopped hearing in quiet moments. "I'm sorry, Mama. I tried to protect Henry. I couldn't do it." She pulled him against her and told him it was never his fault, that he was the bravest boy in the whole world. And when he asked if he would see his father and brother in heaven, she told him yes, they were waiting. She would see them all again someday. He smiled at that small and fading but real, and closed his eyes, and his breathing grew shallow, and Eleanor held him through the night, and by morning he was still. When the snow melted enough to open the door, she dug 3 graves in frozen ground with her bare hands. It took 4 days. Her fingers cracked and bled, and her back screamed for rest, and she did not stop. Could not stop, because stopping would have required her to sit with what she was doing, and she was not yet capable of that. She buried Caleb under the oak tree he had loved, the one he said reminded him of a tree from his childhood. She buried her sons beside him, wrapped in the wedding quilt she had sewn herself. Standing over those graves with bleeding hands and a destroyed heart, Eleanor Marsh made her vow to the silent mountains. Never again. I will not let winter take anyone from me again. 4 years later, she was keeping that promise. The valley just hadn't understood it yet. By July of 1887, her property looked like the aftermath of an elaborate campaign that only she understood the strategy of. Canvas tarps stretched between tree limbs shaded racks of drying meat from the harshest afternoon rays. Bushels of root vegetables lay split open on screen frames, their flesh darkening steadily in the mountain air. Cedar racks loaded with salted fish stood in rows near the tree line, filling the clearing with the sharp mineral smell of preservation. She had built a smokehouse from river stones and shaped timber, a squat, dense structure that breathed gray wisps at all hours, even when the rest of the valley slept. She had constructed 7 drying racks, each one taller than a standing man, each capable of holding enough food to carry a small family through weeks of hard isolation. The front porch had been converted into a solar drying station, glass panes angled against sheet metal to trap and concentrate heat. Beneath the cabin floor, accessible through an entrance, hidden under a braided rug, a root cellar waited with its cargo of potatoes and turnips nested in layers of straw and dry sawdust. Bears came to the edges of her clearing, drawn by the smell of curing meat, and turned away. Her neighbors came and turned away for different reasons. Grace Whitmore, the Reverend's wife, held court at her weekly tea gathering with a sour expression her friends had learned to read like weather. She has so much food drying up there that she must think God himself is about to starve us all. The woman has clearly gone touched. Her husband, Reverend Thomas Whitmore, sat in the corner saying nothing for a long, deliberate moment. He was the kind of man who chose his words with the care of someone who understood they could not be recalled. When he finally spoke, his voice carried no heat. She's also the only person in this valley who isn't running a tab at Hollis's store. The room went silent. Grace's expression curdled. The Reverend picked up his coffee and offered nothing further, but Eleanor, had she been present, would have recognized in him the particular quality of someone who sees everything and waits for the right moment. That moment would come, and it would matter more than anyone in that parlor could have guessed. Clay Barker was a different kind of problem. A tall man, wide through the shoulders, with eyes that stayed on women who had no husband to notice. He had twice before suggested to Eleanor that a woman alone needed company, and both times she had ended the conversation before it became anything else. In mid-July, he rode to the edge of her property and called out from a calculated distance, careful because he had learned that stepping onto her land uninvited produced in her a particular stillness, more unsettling than anger. You ought to remarry before you turn to ice up here. I know some decent men who'd take you in. Eleanor didn't look up from the tomatoes she was slicing her knife, moving in the steady rhythm of someone who had long since stopped, needing their full attention for the task. I know some decent men too, Clay. You're not one of them. Get off my property. He rode away with a look she catalogued without expression, the look of a man unaccustomed to dismissal storing it up. She reinforced her door locks that evening and checked the rifle. The man who arrived without mockery or agenda, carrying only curiosity and a quiet professional respect that Eleanor had not encountered in a long time, was Dr. Owen Harker. He had come to Cedar Bluff from Philadelphia 3 years earlier, a widower seeking the specific distance that only geography provides. His wife Elizabeth had died of consumption, and he had come west with the kind of grief that doesn't announce itself but reshapes everything it touches. He was 38, steady-handed, and possessed the eyes of a man who had witnessed suffering without becoming indifferent to it. He treated every patient the same regardless of what they could pay, which made him trusted in Cedar Bluff and only moderately solvent. He found Eleanor gathering herbs at the pine forest edge on a late July afternoon, the heat pressing down from a sky so blue it seemed almost aggressive. He sat on a nearby rock and watched her work before speaking. Not from awkwardness, but because he had observed that Eleanor Marsh responded better to people who didn't immediately fill the air around her with noise. I've been reading about some of the preservation techniques you're using, he said when the moment felt right. Several trace back to methods developed specifically for this climate. Others I recognize from accounts of early frontier settlements. Where did you learn them? Eleanor paused her work, and the pause itself was notable. She had not paused for anyone in months. My husband spent 2 years with a Crow family in Montana when he was 18 before we met. They taught him how to read the land, how to prepare for what the seasons were building toward. He taught me everything he knew. And you're preparing for winter. Not a question. An observation returned to her. I'm preparing for the worst winter this valley has ever seen. She looked at him directly, then measuring something. Most people hear that and start backing toward the door. Harker was quiet for a moment. I was in Philadelphia during the winter of 1881. Snow buried the city for 3 weeks. Railroads froze. Food couldn't get through. People died in their homes surrounded by furniture and silver they couldn't eat. He met her gaze without flinching. I know exactly what it costs to be unprepared. I know the specific weight of that bill when it comes due. It was the first real conversation Eleanor had permitted herself in longer than she could precisely locate. The first time someone had spoken to her as a person with knowledge worth respecting rather than a curiosity worth examining from a comfortable distance. You're the only person in this valley who hasn't laughed at me, she said. Perhaps I'm the only one who's seen what you've seen. He stood and brushed pine needles from his coat. If you ever need medical supplies, an extra pair of hands, or someone to talk to without having to defend yourself, first I'm here, Mipamam. He paused at the clearing's edge. I hope you're including yourself in your preparations, Eleanor. Whatever's coming doesn't make distinctions. That night she began keeping a different kind of record, not just weather signs and supply calculations, but the names of people who might survive what was coming and the names of people who would not unless something changed. Dr. Harker quietly began stocking his clinic with extra supplies the following week. He didn't announce it, Eleanor noticed. She had been keeping weather records for 4 summers. A small cloth-covered notebook, pages dense with compact handwriting, dates, temperatures, animal behaviors, cloud formations. The swallows had never left before August 10th, not once in 4 years of careful observation. On July 28th, they poured south in great dark rivers, thousands of them streaming overhead with the focused urgency of creatures receiving information through channels human beings have long since forgotten they ever possessed. Eleanor stood in her clearing, watching them go, and wrote the date twice, underlining it both times. The geese followed within days, formations honking south a full month ahead of any historical schedule, the sound of them fading toward warmer climates long before the valley's first golden leaves had dropped. The squirrels were unlike anything she had watched before, not industrious, but frantic, gathering with an edge of desperation that no animal in a normal season would need to feel. She had seen squirrels prepare. She had never seen squirrels panic. There was a distinction between those two states, and it mattered considerably. Caleb had explained animal behavior to her in their first winter together, standing on the porch in early November, watching a flock tighten its formation going south. They don't predict weather, he'd said, his voice the unhurried kind that settles into memory permanently. They receive it. There's a difference. Prediction is a guess. What they do is closer to reading a letter that's already been written. He had learned this living with the Crow family at 18, absorbing the understanding that the land speaks in a continuous language most people have simply stopped bothering to hear. Eleanor had listened. She had practiced. She had not forgotten. Standing in the clearing on July 28th, with the last swallows disappearing over the southern ridge, she felt the familiar cold certainty settle into her bones. Not fear exactly, but its more useful relative. She had felt something like this once before in November of 1883, when a shift in wind had produced a smell that reached when something animal in her before her mind caught up. She had dismissed it then because she had not yet learned that the thing inside you that knows without reasoning is older and more reliable than the thing that requires an explanation first. She would not dismiss it now. Judge Silas Vance arrived on the 15th of July, which was in any honest accounting too early in the season to be coincidental. He was 55 years old, built narrow and tall, as a stripped willow with gray eyes that held the warmth of riverbed stones in midwinter. He had come to Cedar Bluff a decade earlier, carrying a leather suitcase and a territorial appointment granting him authority over legal disputes throughout the region. No one asked where he'd been before Denver. The whispers said he'd gotten tangled in something back east, or that he'd killed a man in a duel and needed considerable distance. Vance had a talent for making whispers stop, which was its own kind of answer to any question about his character. Over 10 years in the valley, he had assembled the kind of empire that is built not with labor or invention, but with patience and paperwork. He owned a quarter of the land in Cedar Bluff. He lent money at rates that made honest men do the arithmetic twice and then do it again, hoping the numbers were different. When debts came due, unpayable, property transferred. He had accumulated farms and businesses and homes the way water accumulates in the lowest point of any landscape without visible effort, simply by being what he was and waiting for everything else to flow downhill toward him. He had tried to buy Eleanor's land 3 times. The first attempt came within weeks of Caleb's death, when Eleanor was still in the particular numbness that follows a loss too vast to hold all at once. He had knocked with a sympathetic expression and a stack of legal documents, and called it a fair price for a widow in difficult circumstances. She had found enough voice to say no. The second time, 6 months later, he had cataloged practical difficulties. A woman alone, hard country, heavy work, and her answer had been firmer. The third time, he had dropped the pretense entirely and told her plainly that her land was too valuable to be managed by someone who didn't know its uses. She had picked up Caleb's rifle. He had left. He came back on a black horse on that July afternoon, boots polished despite the dusty road, black vest buttoned with precision in the summer heat. His eyes moved across her yard with the focused assessment of a man tabulating as he went the drying racks, the tarps, the smokehouse, the jars catching light in the cabin windows. "I hear you've been buying all the salt at Hollis's store. 3 trips in the last month." Eleanor did not look up from the fish she was cleaning, her hands moving in the unhurried rhythm of long practice. She knew exactly how Vance had come by that information. Hollis's Ledger Dutton's morning coffee visits a chain of casual transmission that required no conspiracy and no effort. "What exactly are you preparing for winter?" she said. Simple, unelaborated. Vance smiled, and nothing behind his eyes moved. "We're in the middle of July. The pass road is open. The supply depot is fully stocked. The valley hasn't been this prosperous in years." He took a slow step forward, the kind designed to test rather than to arrive. "Unless you know something the rest of us don't." Eleanor turned and looked at him directly. She had been doing this, meeting his gaze without flinching, without rushing to fill the silence with deference. Since the first time he knocked on her door, and it consistently produced in him a small internal recalibration, the adjustment of a man whose calculations had not accounted for a woman who declined to behave as predicted. "I know winter always comes," she said, "and I know that people who aren't ready for it die. I've watched it happen. I will not watch it happen again." They held each other's gaze across the yard, full of evidence that one of them had spent considerably more time thinking about the future. Then Vance turned and walked back to his horse with that unhurried quality that was either genuine confidence or its most convincing performance. "I've met many widows in my time, Eleanor. Most of them eventually arrive at practical decisions. You're the only one who's chosen to sit on this hill storing food like the world is ending." He mounted and looked down from the saddle, and something in those gray eyes had shifted from the curiosity of July to the longer, colder calculation of a man beginning to make plans. Circumstances change. They always do. And when they do, people often find they need things they once refused. He touched the brim of his hat. "I'll be seeing you." He rode away without waiting for her response. Eleanor watched until he disappeared behind the tree line, her jaw set against the specific fury of knowing exactly what a person is doing and not yet having the means to prevent it. Vance was circling. He had done it to other families, the Fenwicks after their barn fire, the Aldermans after 3 failed harvests, orbiting their difficulties with patient timing until the right moment of weakness presented itself, and the right words arrived to make acquisition look like mercy. He had never failed at this particular kind of waiting, and he did not expect to start. She worked until midnight that night and was back at it before the sky had fully lightened. The last day of July brought a night sky that carried a different quality than summer warranted. Stars burned with an unusual sharpness, clear in a way that felt less like beauty and more like warning. The wind had shifted north sometime after dark, carrying a chill with no seasonal business being there, in the height of summer, and she stood on the porch with her eyes closed and identified at the very edge of what could be called perception, the smell of snow, distant, moving, patient. Not this week, not this month, but committed to arriving with the indifferent certainty of things that cannot be reasoned with. On the highest northern peaks, barely visible against the darkening sky, clouds were building where no clouds built in July, white and dense, carrying moisture, the way a loaded freight wagon carries weight slowly without hurry, fully committed to reaching its destination. Preparation is not a hedge against what might happen, she thought watching them form. It is the only honest acknowledgement that what will happen is already on its way. You're coming early this year, she said quietly to the wind, and the wind offered no denial because the wind had never lied to her the way people had. But this time I'm ready. She went inside and worked until the sky came up gray in the east. September did not arrive with the gentle amber light of an ordinary Montana autumn. It came with the fury of something that had been restraining itself all summer and had finally run out of patience. Rain fell not in sheets but in walls, sustained, driving methodical hammering. The valley roads into channels of brown water and swelling the creek below the ridge to a roar audible from inside closed cabins with the windows sealed. Cedar Bluff's lifeline was a single road, 20 miles of switchback trail, climbing over the mountain range to the supply depot on the far side. Every month, wagons made that journey, carrying flour, sugar, medicine, coffee tools, everything a remote community could not produce for itself. The valley had never questioned whether that road would be there. It had always been there. The first week of rain, 2 supply wagons failed to arrive. One driver had turned back when his horses refused to continue through the deepening mud. The second sent no word at all. By the second week, the town's reserves were running lower than expected, and the particular quiet that descends on communities when they begin to genuinely worry had settled along Cedar Bluff's main street. People bought what remained in Hollis's store with urgency. They were still calling caution. Children were told to finish what was on their plates. On the night the landslide came, lightning split the sky in continuous flashes, and thunder shook the mountains with a concussive force that had nothing in common with an ordinary storm. Eleanor heard it before she saw it, a rumbling that rose from somewhere beneath the register of ordinary sound, a vibration bypassing hearing entirely and registering in the chest and feet, in the older, more fundamental parts of the body that have not forgotten what genuine danger feels like. She ran outside without taking time to reason through whether she should rain soaking through her clothes in seconds, and she saw it in the stuttering illumination of lightning, the western mountainside in motion. Not a section of it, a mass of it, trees snapping without resistance, boulders the size of ox carts bouncing down toward the canyon with the careless momentum of things that have never known opposition. The event lasted 4 minutes and remade the world. Where the pass road had been, there was now a wall of debris stretching from one canyon wall to the other, 100 feet deep at its lowest point, still settling, still sending small flows of earth and stone down its face in the rain. The only road out of Cedar Bluff Valley, the only way supplies could come in before spring had ceased to exist. The rain did not stop. In the morning, Ezra Hollis nailed a notice to the post office door with hands that were not entirely steady. His face had shed the comfortable neutrality of a prosperous storekeeper and replaced it with something rawer, the beginning of a fear that could not yet admit what it already knew. Eleanor stood on her porch in the gray early light and watched Cedar Bluff come apart at its edges. Men ran and shouted without anyone coordinating. Women held children with the tightness of people who have just understood for the first time that holding is not the same as protecting. Horses threw their heads and stamped, receiving the panic of their riders through direct contact. For the first time in months, something cut through the cold, focused clarity of preparation. Not fear for herself, never for herself. She had already lost everything that could be lost, and the worst had not killed her, but a sharp blade of fear for the children down there, the ones who would cry in the dark when hunger arrived. The ones whose parents would stand at their bedsides with empty hands, in the specific helplessness of people who believed the supply wagon would always come because it always had. She had been those children once. She had been that helpless parent. She had held small hands going cold and sung lullabies into silence and buried everything she loved in frozen ground. She had made a vow over 3 graves on a winter morning 4 years ago, and she intended to keep it, and she understood now with complete clarity that keeping it was not going to require only what she had stored below the floorboards and on the shelves of her smokehouse. It was going to require everything she had left. The rows of sealed jars stood inside the cabin, waiting in the filtered morning light. The root cellar held its silent inventory. The smokehouse sent its gray thread into the cold air above the ridge, steady and patient, like a signal fire that had been burning for months, visible to anyone willing to look up from the valley floor long enough to see it. What was coming would not be survived by the strongest or the wealthiest or the most respected people in Cedar Bluff. It would be survived by the people who had prepared, and in this valley, in this autumn, that was one woman on a ridge that the rest of the town had spent the summer laughing at. The battle for survival, not hers alone, but the survival of every child who had not yet gone hungry enough to understand what their parents had failed to do, had stopped being a future event. It was here, it was now, and Eleanor Marsh was the only person in Cedar Bluff Valley who was ready for it. October crawled into Cedar Bluff on its belly, dragging cold winds and dying expectations behind it like a wounded animal unwilling to admit it couldn't go any further. The pass road stayed buried. The strongest men in the valley had tried to dig through the debris for 4 days after the landslide, working in organized crews with shovels and determination and the optimism of people who have not yet exhausted their belief that effort produces results. They stopped on the fourth day when a boulder the size of a loaded hay wagon shifted without warning and rolled through the exact spot where two men had been standing seconds before. No one volunteered after that. The mountain had made its position clear. Judge Vance called a town meeting at the church and stood at the pulpit with the composure of a man who had spent decades performing authority for audiences uncertain enough to accept the performance. His voice was measured, his reasoning impeccable in the way of plans that ask other people to absorb the cost. "We wait until spring," he announced to the assembled faces gaunt, already tightened with the particular anxiety of people who have started counting what's left and not liking the numbers. "When the ground stabilizes, we'll clear the road. Until then, we ration what we have and trust in God's providence." What he did not say, and what every person present calculated privately in the silence that followed, was that Cedar Bluff's communal grain store held perhaps 2 months of food at half rations, that most families had grown accustomed to buying staples week by week at Hollis's store rather than building any meaningful reserve, and that God's providence had historically required a working supply chain to express itself. By mid-October, the valley's economy collapsed, the way overstressed structures collapse, not slowly and then catastrophically, but all at once, the whole thing going simultaneously. A good rifle bought half a sack of beans. Quality ironware earned a few pounds of dried corn. Silver candlesticks that had crossed the country in family wagons, surviving the journey that killed weaker things, exchanged hands for amounts that would have been embarrassing to offer a month earlier. Ezra Hollis sat behind his counter, turning people away with a hollowness in his face that had replaced whatever professional ease once lived there. "Nothing left. I'm sorry. There's nothing left." The words wore grooves into his throat from repetition. On the main street and in the tavern and in the careful quiet of frightened households, the men who had laughed loudest that summer began looking up at the eastern ridge with different calculations in their eyes. Smoke still curled from the chimney on the hill. Candlelight still showed in the windows after dark. Whatever madness had driven Eleanor Marsh to work through every day of the previous summer, as though survival were a job that could not be postponed, it did not seem like madness anymore. It seemed like the only sane decision made by anyone in the valley in 6 months. Wade Dutton, who had pointed and laughed in June with the confidence of a man who believes certainty is a permanent condition, sat in the tavern, with whiskey he couldn't afford, and something corroded and hot in his chest that was partly resentment and partly the specific shame of having been wrong about something that mattered enormously. That woman knew. She knew this was coming. The men around him didn't argue, but none of them climbed the ridge either. Not yet. Pride is the last luxury people surrender, and they surrender it only when the alternative is something worse. Noah Cole arrived at midnight on the 20th of October, and Eleanor heard his knock, the way she heard everything that summer, immediately completely awake before the second sound came, her hand reaching for the rifle before her eyes had fully adjusted to the dark. She opened the door to a crack of cold air and the shape of a boy who had traveled some distance past the point where bodies should be asked to keep moving. 16-year-old shoulders that should have been broad with the particular promise of a young man's frame, but were instead sharp angles under a shirt too thin for the temperature, eyes too large for the face they were in. He stood in the darkness, shivering in a way that had passed the visible stage and was now internal, the kind of cold that has gotten into the machinery. "Please," the word came out fractured, broken over his chattering teeth. "Please, ma'am, just one piece of bread. I'm not asking to stay. One piece is all." Eleanor studied him through the narrow opening, the caved-in cheeks, the cracked lips, the way his collarbone pressed visibly against his skin when he breathed. and made the calculation that people who have nearly died themselves are faster at making than people who haven't. She asked his name. She asked about his parents, and the boy was quiet for a moment that contained several years of complicated history before he answered that his mother had died of fever 2 years back, and his father wasn't really his father anymore, just a man who drank and forgot he had a son. Noah Cole took one step forward when she opened the door wider and his legs surrendered beneath him before he crossed the threshold, folding without drama, the body finally communicating what the mind had been overriding for days. When he woke, the warmth was disorienting enough that he lay still for a long time, not entirely certain he was still alive. And this wasn't some adjacent state he had not been prepared for. The smell of broth reached him before anything else rich with fish and herbs he couldn't identify. Individually, a smell so dense with sustenance it felt almost physical. Eleanor sat across the room, watching him with eyes that contained no warmth, but also no cruelty. The gaze of a person who has learned to assess rather than emote, who cannot afford the luxury of offering comfort before necessity has been addressed. When he tried to sit up, she didn't move to help him, and he understood, without being told, that this was deliberate. She was watching to see what he was, not just what condition he was in. The cabin shelves stopped his breath the way a sudden drop in altitude stops it. Reds and oranges and deep purples in sealed glass jars, catching the firelight, colors he had stopped expecting to exist in the world outside his memory. Dried herbs and hanging from every rafter, their combined fragrance layering into something that had no single name. The smell of smoked meat threading through everything. More food than he had seen in weeks, assembled with a precision that told him immediately it had not been gathered carelessly. He ate the broth in small sips the way she told him to, feeling warmth move outward from his stomach, like a tide slowly reconquering territory it had lost. Eleanor laid out 4 rules with the economy of someone who has refined important information to its essential components and has no interest in expanding it. Work every day, no exceptions. Tell no one what this cabin holds. Take nothing without permission. Everything was counted, recorded, known. If trouble came, stand behind her and follow her lead, because bravery was a story people told about survival after the fact, and preparation was the thing that actually produced it. Noah agreed to all 4 immediately, then lay back down with the biscuit she placed in his lap and slept with the quality of someone who has finally been given permission to stop fighting for a few hours. Frank Cole came 3 days later. Eleanor heard him on the path before she saw him. A heavy, unsteady gait, the particular rhythm of a man whose legs have been negotiating with his center of gravity for so long they've stopped expecting to win. He had been a blacksmith once, a man whose reputation for ironwork had reached 3 counties, who had taught his son to ride and whittle and read the signs of weather coming. That man had drowned himself in increments over 2 years, and what arrived at the base of the ridge was what remained large and hollowed simultaneously, carrying a pistol in one shaking hand and an expression that had been intended as rage but had picked up too much grief on the journey to stay purely anything. "Give me back my son." His words slurred and bled into each other. "You kidnapper. You witch. I know he's in there." Eleanor stepped onto the porch without the rifle in her hands, though it was within reach because she had read the situation accurately and knew that what Frank Cole needed was not to be confronted with superior force, but to be spoken to directly by someone who was not afraid of him, which was currently the most destabilizing thing she could offer. She told him plainly what she had found, a 16-year-old boy whose ribs were visible through his shirt, who had not eaten in 3 days, whose father's choices had put him on a midnight road in October cold. You let that happen. You let your own child starve while you drank yourself into whatever this is. Frank raised the pistol in a hand trembling badly enough up to make it theater rather than threat. Then Noah appeared in the doorway beside her, and whatever had kept Frank upright seemed to reconfigure itself. He looked at his son, not at the adversary, not at Eleanor, and something moved through his expression that was the wreckage of the man he had intended to be when he made promises at his wife's deathbed. Noah's voice came out steady in the way that things are steady when they have been decided rather than merely chosen. "Go home, father." 3 words, final as a closed door. Frank Cole's arm dropped, his shoulders collapsed inward. He turned and walked back down the ridge without another word, and Eleanor watched his retreating shape and felt not satisfaction, but the heavy, specific sadness of watching someone lose a battle against themselves. She sat beside Noah on the porch afterward in complete silence. She did not attempt to address what he had just done, the permanent version of a thing that cannot be undone, the severing of a connection frayed too many times to hold any more weight. There were no words useful enough for that moment, and she had learned years ago that the absence of words was not the same as the absence of presence, and that presence was sometimes the only honest thing one person could offer another. Eventually, Noah said thank you in a voice barely above a murmur, and Eleanor told him not to thank her and to go inside and get back to work because the fish wouldn't smoke itself, and she let the corner of her mouth move just slightly in a direction that was almost but not quite something warmer, and Noah saw it and understood it was the closest thing to welcome she was currently capable of extending. The first true snow arrived in early November, and it fell with the absolute indifferent commitment of something that has waited all summer to say its piece. 5 feet in 2 nights. The creek locked solid. Chickens froze where they stood in their coops, becoming still-feathered monuments to the failure of unprepared things to survive the prepared world. 2 infants died before their families understood that the temperature inside unheated rooms had crossed a threshold that small bodies cannot negotiate. A house fire on the south end of town killed a mother and her young son when stones heated on a stove radiating too much into dry wood went past the point of recovery in the time it took to notice. Neighbors arrived to smoke and loss and two shapes that the fire had reduced to something unrecognizable. Cedar Bluff stopped making sound after that. The particular silence of a community that has understood its situation, really understood it not as an inconvenience or a difficult winter, but as a genuine test of who survives and who doesn't, settled over the valley like a second snowfall. 3 families climbed the ridge together on a gray morning, 12 days into November, and Eleanor watched them come from the cabin window. Before they knocked, Wade Dutton led the group, and the transformation in his bearing from the man who had stood outside Hollis's store pointing and laughing in June was complete enough to belong to a different person, shoulders forward, chin down, moving through the snow with the diminished quality of pride that has finally cost more than it was worth keeping. Behind him came his wife and their 3 children and 2 other families, with 7 children more, between them, all of them reduced to the same condition by the same failure to prepare, all of them arriving at a door they had been too certain they would never need. Eleanor, Dutton's voice cracked on the second syllable. We know what we said. We know how we treated you. We're not here to pretend otherwise. But our children haven't had a real meal in days. We'll give you anything we have left. He stopped there, having reached the limit of what his vocabulary for humility could construct. Eleanor stood in the doorway with the warmth of the cabin at her back and looked at the children. Thin faces, eyes too wide, and features that had begun to shed the softness that children's faces are supposed to hold. She looked at the parents and recognized in every one of them the expression she had worn standing over 3 graves, the absolute gutting helplessness of loving someone you cannot protect. She made her decision in the space of 3 seconds, and it was not a cold decision, but it was a precise one. She had done the arithmetic for weeks, and the arithmetic was immovable. Only the children come inside. The adults go back to town. Dutton stared. We'll die out there without, Eleanor cut through the objection with the flat certainty of someone who has finished the argument already. Then find shelter, build fires. Do what you should have done 6 months ago when I was preparing and you were laughing at me. I don't have enough space or food to keep everyone alive. If I take all of you, none of us see spring. The children stay, you go. Bring a load of firewood up this ridge every day, 1 load per child. No wood, no food. That is the arrangement. What followed was the hardest kind of moment, parents pushing their children forward with hands that didn't want to release, kissing foreheads and squeezing shoulders and saying things in a small ears that Eleanor didn't try to hear because they belonged to those families alone. The adults turned and walked back down the hill, every one of them looking back multiple times, and Eleanor let them look because she understood that looking was all they had left. She closed the door. 14 people now occupied a 2-room cabin built for 4, and Eleanor established the order of things, immediately gathering the children around the fire and speaking to them with a directness that did not condescend and did not soften. What was true, every child had work. Every task mattered. Nothing was optional, and food was not infinite. If we waste, we die. If we save, we live. That's the only arithmetic that counts now. Noah became her deputy without anyone formally designating him as such. It happened the way necessary things happen through demonstrated competence and the quiet authority of someone who moves toward problems rather than away from them. He was 17 in bearing, if not yet in years, and he managed the smaller children with a patience that Eleanor recognized as coming from somewhere particular in his own history, the patience of a child who had learned to be careful around unpredictable things and had converted that education into something useful. Owen Prentice arrived a week later carrying his daughter. He was a miller by trade, a quiet man whose hand still held the permanent ghost of flour in every crease, and he came not to ask shelter for himself, but only for the small person bundled in rags in his arms. His wife had died giving birth a year earlier, and he had been raising this child alone in the particular way of men who love deeply but have no one to teach them how to express it practically. Clara was 6 years old with eyes the precise blue of a July sky on a cloudless morning and a steadiness that had no business existing in a 6-year-old's frame. When Eleanor looked at her directly and asked her flatly whether she could help, Clara's answer came without hesitation. I sweep good. I don't cry. Eleanor stepped back from the door without saying yes, which was its own form of yes. Owen Prentice wept outside the cabin door with the full-body grief of a man surrendering his only remaining reason to stay standing, and he kissed his daughter's cheek and said something quietly into her ear, and then he walked into the white without looking back, because men sometimes understand that looking back is the one thing they cannot afford. He came every Sunday after the snows softened enough to make the ridge passable, and Clara always ran to meet him. But the ridge was home now. Some decisions make themselves. Clara proved to be unlike any child Eleanor had encountered in 42 years of living among them. She did not cry when her stomach was empty, which it frequently was, despite Eleanor's careful rationing. She did not complain about the crowded cabin or the cold or the strict accounting of every resource. She swept floors until they gleamed. She stacked firewood with a geometric care that suggested she had understood immediately that precision in small things was not the same as rigidity, but was in fact its opposite, a form of respect for scarcity. She helped smaller children with their tasks without being asked from some internal compass that pointed automatically toward wherever help was needed. And every night before sleep, she came and sat beside Eleanor near the fire, not touching, never demanding contact, simply present in the particular way of someone who needs to confirm that a specific person is still in the room. 3 weeks into this ritual, Eleanor asked her directly what she wanted. Clara looked up from the fire with those steady blue eyes that contained more age than the rest of her. I just want to know you're still here. Something in Eleanor's chest, frozen at a depth that 4 years of survival had not reached, began to thaw, by a degree too small to name, but real enough to feel. I'm here, she said. I'm not going anywhere. Clara leaned against her arm by approximately the width of a breath, and Eleanor did not move away, and neither of them said anything further, and the fire cracked and settled, and outside the snow continued its patient work of making the world simpler and more dangerous. Old Walt Greer came in December, 70 years built into a frame that had been tall once and now carried its height at a slight forward lean, a white beard, and eyes that had accumulated the specific softness of someone who has read extensively about human suffering and emerged without bitterness. He had nowhere to go and had outlived every particular obligation, and he brought with him a mind stocked with stories from across the full range of American frontier history, surveyors caught in the Rockies, settlers who waited out impossible winters in the Black Hills, miners who survived weeks of isolation in hand-dug shelters that the snow itself insulated. He told these stories every night to the circle of children around the fire, in a voice that knew exactly when to slow down and when to lean in, and what he gave them was not distraction, but something more durable, evidence that ordinary Americans had survived worse, armed, with nothing more exotic than the refusal to stop. Ruth Alderman arrived the same week, and there was a particular charge in the moment when Eleanor opened the door and found the woman who had called her a vampire standing in the snow, looking 10 years older than she had in September. Ruth did not apologize with words, and Eleanor did not require it. Ruth asked what needed doing and was told, and she did it, and the two women worked side by side through December and into January, in a silence that accumulated warmth gradually, the way all honest friendships do, without announcement or ceremony. At the end of November, Eleanor found the footprints. Two sets made by heavy boots circling the cabin at a consistent distance that suggested calculation close enough to observe far enough to avoid the ring of steel traps she had laid around the perimeter in mid-November. They had not approached the door. They had not left marks suggesting purpose. They had simply moved in patient assessment around the edges of the one place in Cedar Bluff Valley that held enough food to change the winter's outcome for anyone desperate enough to take it by force. She showed the tracks to Noah in the early morning cold, their breath merging in small clouds as they crouched over the impressions. "Hungry men come to the door," she said. "These men are making a plan." She didn't need to verify the names. Conrad Holt had a history in Cedar Bluff that required no documentation. A stint in territorial jail for beating his sister-in-law nearly to death, a reputation for violence that arrived before he did. In any room, he entered the kind of man communities keep track of the way they keep track of unstable weather. His brother Seth was the more dangerous version of the same threat, quieter, more patient, possessed of the intelligence that transforms aggression into strategy. They had been living at the valley's edge through the winter, hunting for food in the frozen wilderness, and the hunting had not been sufficient. Eleanor reinforced the cabin's defenses with the same methodical attention she brought to everything. Additional steel traps deployed around the perimeter jaws strong enough to hold a bear hidden under thin snowfall spread to look undisturbed. She taught Noah tactical positioning, not marksmanship, which he already had, but the geometry of staying alive in a confined space under fire. How to move between cover positions without presenting a sustained target. How to make ammunition count when there is a fixed amount of it and an uncertain number of rounds incoming. The children learned signals a specific knock pattern that meant stay down and away from windows, understood by the smallest ones, through repetition rather than explanation. The trap took Clay Barker at 2 in the morning on a night the moon had taken itself elsewhere, leaving the world in the flat darkness that experienced hunters use as cover and that Eleanor had used as opportunity. She heard the snap before the scream, and she was outside in the time it took the scream to reach its full register. He was on the ground in the snow, thrashing with the specific energy of something caught rather than simply injured, working his blood-slicked fingers against the steel in an attempt to open it that his compromised grip couldn't execute. 2 toes gone cleanly, blood steamed in the cold air with a faint hiss. Eleanor stood over him with the rifle pointing and the expression of someone who is neither surprised nor particularly moved. She released the trap mechanism. "Go see Dr. Harker," she said. "Tell him whatever story serves you. But if you tell anyone what you tried to do tonight in a cabin full of children who are fighting to stay alive, I'll make certain every person in this valley knows what Clay Barker came up here for." He crawled away, leaving a red trail across the white. No one attempted entry after that. The words circulated through Cedar Bluff, through the particular underground of a small, frightened community. Eleanor Marsh had traps, she had a rifle, and she had the disposition of a woman who has already lost the things worth protecting and cannot therefore be threatened with the same losses twice. This information reached the Holt brothers and was absorbed into their planning rather than deterring it. Seth Holt was the kind of man who updated his approach when a first approach failed, which made him considerably more dangerous than a man who simply tried the same thing harder. Vance came in February on a morning when ice fog had lowered the world to a radius of 30 feet, everything beyond it dissolved to white. He came alone, which meant either genuine confidence or the specific miscalculation of a man who has never been refused by a woman and cannot fully integrate that Eleanor Marsh represented a new category. He proposed the community storehouse with the framing of civic altruism. She would manage it, the community would benefit, the land would transfer to the town council, which was to say to him. His voice was calm, reasonable, empty of the threat he was actually delivering. Eleanor let him finish. "You came to my door the week after I buried my husband," she said. "You had papers and a sympathetic expression, and the same thing you have right now, dressed in different clothes. The answer hasn't changed." When he shifted to the threat, the whispers already circulating that she had known about the landslide in advance, that she had chosen who lived and who died, she looked at him steadily and said what she had been thinking since the moment she identified what kind of man he was. "Everything you just said is a confession of exactly how far you're willing to go. Innocent men don't need to manufacture accusations. Vance left without resolution, and Eleanor called the adults together that night, Noah, Ruth, Walt, and told them plainly that a man who had survived in Cedar Bluff for a decade by making problems disappear would not accept a refusal he had expected to be unnecessary. He'll move when he thinks the moment is right. We don't give him a right moment. Seth Holt had been watching the cabin for 6 weeks before he decided the moment was right. He had mapped their patterns with the patience of someone who understands that information gathered slowly is more reliable than information gathered quickly. He knew when Noah took children to check fish traps at the frozen creek below the ridge. He knew the route, the timing, the composition of the group. He had watched Conrad absorb this information and had given his brother a specific instruction: take the food the children were carrying, don't fire, don't escalate. Conrad Holt was a man who had never successfully followed a specific instruction in his life, because the part of him that processed instructions was chronically overpowered by the part that responded to sudden stimuli with force. Seth knew this and calculated that it was acceptable risk. This calculation was the worst mistake he ever made. The ice fog on the morning of January 15th was not weather so much as erasure. It had come down overnight and converted the world into a featureless, white silence, in which sound traveled strangely and shapes resolved from the mist only when they were already close. Noah took Billy Crane and a girl of 12 named Patience out to the creek traps at the usual hour because routine was itself a form of defense. Deviation attracted notice, and the creek traps were a consistent source of food that could not be abandoned on the basis of unverifiable threat. He knew the path well enough to walk it in total darkness, which the fog approximated. Billy Crane was 9 years old, compact and energetic, in the way of children who have not yet learned to contain themselves, with blonde hair that stuck out in multiple directions regardless of what was done to it, and brown eyes that held genuine joy, even in the circumstances of a hunger winter in a stranded valley. He had a specific gift: he could make Clara laugh consistently and without effort through combinations of expression and timing that were either natural talent or some undefinable grace. He made her laugh even on the days the cabin was quietest, even in the evenings when the food was thinnest, and in a collection of frightened children and frightened adults, the sound of Clara's laughter had become something the cabin needed the way it needed firewood functionally regularly as a specific form of warmth. Conrad stepped out from behind a large pine 8 feet off the path. His intention was the threat of his size and the gun in his hand, and for 3 seconds that intention might have been achievable. Then Noah heard him and turned, and his hand moved toward the small pistol Eleanor insisted he carry on every trip outside. And Conrad Holt's nervous system did what it always had done. In moments of sudden challenge, it fired before the mind could intervene. Billy was turning toward the sound when the bullet found him. It went into his chest, and the impact spun him sideways, and Noah caught him before he reached the snow, already pressing his hand over the wound, before Billy's expression had completed its transition from surprise to pain. Patience was already running, screaming back up the ridge, her voice bouncing off the poo and returning diminished. "Run," Noah had told her, and she ran, and he held Billy with both arms, in the terrible clarity of someone who recognized a mortal wound and could not stop calling it something else. "It hurts, Noah." Billy's voice was thin and distant in a way that had nothing to do with the fog. "Why does it hurt so bad?" "Hold on, just hold on. Mrs. Eleanor will know what to do." The words came out with the specific quality of lies told not to deceive, but to fill a void while the speaker processes what the truth is, because the truth in that moment was that Billy's blood was warm against Noah's hands and cooling the moment it met the air, and the light behind the boy's eyes was retreating the way light retreats in a room when someone carries a lamp away. "Tell Clara I'm sorry I can't make her laugh anymore." Billy's voice was nearly gone now, a sound at the edge of what could be registered. "You can tell her yourself. We're going back right now. Hold on." But Billy's eyes had found something in the white mist above them that Noah couldn't see, and his face lost its pain the way faces do, when pain is no longer the body's primary business. And he said he thought he could see his grandmother. She was waving at him, and then he stopped saying anything and stopped breathing, and Noah held him in the bloody snow for a long moment that required no duration to be complete, and then he stood up and carried him home. Eleanor met him at the door. She looked at Billy's stillness, at the blood soaking through Noah's clothes, at the expression on Noah's face that she recognized from her own mirror in the weeks after she lost her family, the look of someone who will be processing this moment for the rest of their life, which they now understand is the correct length of time for that particular processing. Something in her own face underwent a change that the children present noticed and would not fully articulate until years later. Not grief yet that would come, but something that had been dormant, reactivating itself. Something ancient and very cold and very focused. Who? One word. I didn't see clearly, but I heard a voice before the shot. One of them called the other Conrad. Eleanor nodded once slowly. She took Billy from Noah's arms and carried him inside and laid him gently on a blanket near the fire, and she smoothed his hair from his forehead and closed his eyes, and the children gathered in silence. Because children understand death without needing it, explained when they see it close. Clara pushed through to the front and knelt beside her friend and took his cold hand in both of hers and held it without speaking. They buried Billy behind the cabin the same day in ground that now held 4 occupants. Caleb James Henry and this 9-year-old boy whose offense had been walking a familiar path in morning fog, while the adults of his valley failed to protect him. The children gathered stones for a cairn and wove a cross from willow branches and planted it at the head. Clara placed a small sealed jar of dried apples beside the cross, the last apples from a batch she had helped Eleanor slice and dry back in November, set aside for an occasion she couldn't have named but felt was coming. He always said your apples were the best thing he'd tasted, she said to Eleanor to the grave to no particular address. So he won't go hungry. Eleanor stood at the edge of the gathering with her hands tight at her sides and her jaw locked against what she was not ready to release yet, and she understood with complete certainty that the Holt brothers had committed the one kind of error that cannot be renegotiated. They had killed a child, and Eleanor Marsh had made a vow about children. Dr. Harker arrived at the cabin 2 days later, having pieced the story together from what was audible in town. He examined everyone treated what needed treating and listened to Eleanor's full account with his hands folded and the expression of a man who has seen enough to receive terrible information without requiring a moment to recover. When she finished, he was quiet for what seemed like a deliberate interval. Vance ordered this. Not directly, he ordered what he thought would be a robbery, and Conrad Holt turned it into something worse. But the chain runs straight. He stood and picked up his coat. Men who do what Vance does carry secrets the way all structures carry weight. There's always a weak point. There's always somebody who decides the arithmetic of loyalty has shifted. He paused at the door. Give me time. Don't do anything alone. What Harker did over the following 3 weeks was not dramatic. He asked careful questions of careful people. He had a long conversation with Reverend Thomas Whitmore, the quiet man who had spent the entire winter observing without intervening, gathering information with the patience of someone who knew exactly what he was going to do with it, and was waiting only for the moment when doing it would matter most. Together, methodically, they located the specific weak point Harker had described Seth Holt, who was neither sentimental nor particularly loyal, who had watched his brother die from an infected wound 3 days after the incident at the creek, and who understood that the ground had shifted so completely that sitting still was the most dangerous thing he could do. Seth wanted out of the valley alive. He wanted his debts to Vance formally nullified and his crimes addressed with exile rather than rope. These were negotiable terms for a man willing to provide a public account of what Vance had paid for and what Garrett Lawson had witnessed in the judge's office before the first snow. Harker and Whitmore did not tell Eleanor what they were arranging. They knew she would not stop them, but they also understood that this needed to happen without her visible orchestration, because the town of Cedar Bluff needed to arrive at the truth through witnesses it had not already decided to dismiss, and Eleanor Marsh was not at this particular moment a voice Cedar Bluff could hear without its own complicated feelings getting in the way. The attack on the cabin came 5 nights after Vance's February visit at 3 in the morning, and Eleanor woke to the smell of kerosene before she identified what she was waking to. The smokehouse was already fully engaged, orange fire climbing the stone walls, consuming the wooden roof, devouring what she had worked to preserve against exactly this kind of emergency. 2 weeks of carefully smoked food going to ash while she watched. They want us to run out and save it, she said to Noah, who appeared beside her at the window, already reading the tree lines with the careful attention she had spent months building into his reflexes. Dark shapes retreated toward the forest's edge, one of them carrying what was unmistakably a glass bottle. That's the opening. The fire is the invitation. She pulled him back from the window before he could respond. Get everyone into the back room, away from every window. Now. The cabin reorganized itself in the controlled chaos of a rehearsed emergency. Walt and Ruth, moving the children into the most protected corner furniture, pulled into position as improvised barriers, Clara settling herself in the middle of the younger children with the specific calm of someone who has decided that calm is a contribution she can make. The smokehouse collapsed in a shower of sparks that lit the surrounding snow orange. The first bullet punched through the front window immediately after showering Eleanor with glass. She was already below the sill, counting 3 seconds, then rising just enough to sight toward the muzzle flash she had tracked through the glass spray. She fired once. Someone screamed in the tree line. One, she said, and moved to the next window before anyone could adjust to her position. Noah reported fire from the back quadrant, 2 shots through the rear window, and then silence from that direction. The children in the back room made sounds that were not quite crying, controlled into something more like held breath. Clara's voice, steady and low, reached Eleanor from the back room in fragments, telling the smaller children to keep their heads down, that it was going to be all right, using the same tone she had absorbed from months of sitting beside a woman who communicated safety through stillness. For an hour, they traded shots with shadows. Eleanor moving continuously, never offering a stationary target, making every round count with the precision of someone working through a finite supply against an uncertain demand. When the eastern sky began to lighten, the shooting stopped the attackers falling back with their wounded into the forest cover. Eleanor waited for full light before stepping outside, rifle ready, into the silence of the aftermath. The smokehouse was a ruin. 2 blood trails in the snow ran toward the trees, one of them dragging. She reached down and picked up what she found in the snow near the porch corner, a wide-brimmed leather hat, brown with a distinctive crease in the crown that she had seen on a specific head during specific months of a summer that felt very distant now. Noah confirmed the hat's owner without being asked. Eleanor held it for a moment, then set it on the porch railing. Conrad Holtz, which means Seth Holt was here too. She looked at the devastation of the smokehouse and then at the valley below, where ordinary morning life was resuming along the Main Street, fires being lit in stoves, a few early figures moving between buildings in the cold. We know who sent them, but knowing and proving are different countries, and we currently have no passage between them. She went inside to begin the work of accounting for what had been lost and what remained, which was the only productive response to catastrophe and the one she had been practicing for 4 years. Harker arrived at noon. He moved through the cabin, examining every injury, minor glass and wood fragments, and listened to the full account without interruption. When Eleanor finished, he stood for a long moment at the window, looking out at the smoldering ruin of the smokehouse, and then he turned and said what he had come to say. Seth Holt came to see me 2 nights ago. He wants terms. Reverend Whitmore has been part of the conversation. I think we may have our passage. Reverend Thomas Whitmore called the meeting on a Thursday morning in early March, and the way he did it was deliberate, not a proclamation nailed to the post office door, but a quiet word passed from household to household, through the specific network of trust that survives even the worst winters, because trust is one of the few things that cold cannot kill. He said only that there was important business concerning the community's future, and that attendance was required by conscience, if not by law. Cedar Bluff survivors came in from the cold with the stunned, blinking quality of people who have been in the dark long enough that ordinary light requires adjustment. They filled the church until they were standing against the back wall and crowded into the vestibule, pressing together for warmth and the particular comfort of collective presence after months of isolated endurance. The damage the winter had done to Cedar Bluff was visible in that room in a way no accounting could fully capture. The community that had gathered in this same church the previous June to discuss road maintenance and property disputes and the ordinary administrative business of a prosperous valley was not the community that stood in the pews now. These people had come through something that had sorted them, removed the weak assumptions, the comfortable certainties, the unchallenged beliefs about how the world worked and what could be depended upon. What remained was leaner and more honest, the way anything is more honest after everything inessential has been stripped from it. Judge Silas Vance sat in the front pew in his customary black posture, immaculate, the only person in the room who appeared to have passed the winter in approximately the same condition he had entered it. This was partly illusion and partly the real consequence of being the kind of man who protects his own interests with the systematic thoroughness that other people apply to their families. He had lost money this winter, debts unpayable, properties unmaintainable. The empire of obligation he had spent a decade assembling, now showing the structural weakness of anything built on other people's desperation rather than its own foundation. But he had not gone hungry, and his boots were still polished, and he carried himself with the unbroken authority of a man who has not yet received information capable of breaking it. Seth Holt walked to the front of the church when Reverend Whitmore gestured, and the room's attention followed him with the wariness of people who recognized what he was, but had not anticipated finding him here, in this context presenting himself to the community rather than avoiding it. His left arm was wrapped in bandages that had been changed recently, clean, professionally applied the work of Dr. Harker's hands. The scar on his cheek caught the winter light through the church windows. He stood without visible remorse because Seth Holt was not a remorseful man, and performing remorse would have been immediately legible as performance, and he had negotiated his terms with Harker and Whitmore on the basis of honest accounting rather than moral conversion. What he offered was the truth, and the truth was the only currency he had left. 5 nights ago, my brother Conrad and I attacked the marsh cabin on the eastern ridge, he said, and the room's ambient noise, shuffling feet, muffled coughs. The creak of old pews stopped completely, the way sound stops near a place where something significant is about to happen. We burned her smokehouse. We fired into a building with children inside. We were paid to do it. The gasps came first, then the voices, then the specific churning chaos of a room in which every person is simultaneously processing new information and trying to speak. Vance rose from the front pew, immediately turning to face the room, with the expression of a man whose performance of authority is so deeply practiced that it engages automatically even when the audience has just been told who wrote the script. The word of a confessed criminal against a duly appointed officer of this territory. I won't dignify. Seth Holt's voice cut through the noise with the flatness of a statement rather than a challenge, then explained the money. He reached into his coat and drew out a leather pouch that he dropped onto the floor in front of the pulpit. Gold coins scattered across the wooden boards and rolled into the silence, catching light as they moved, settling one by one into stillness. $50 to burn her out. The promise to forgive everything Conrad and I owed you if we drove her off her land. Explain that, Judge. Vance's expression adjusted almost imperceptibly, the recalibration of a man's shifting strategies in real time, moving from denial to the construction of a plausible alternative narrative. But before he could build it, Seth turned and found Garrett Lawson, with his eyes in the back half of the church. Lawson had positioned himself near an exit with the unconscious instinct of someone who has spent weeks knowing this moment was coming and has not decided how to meet it. The entire room turned to look at him simultaneously, and the weight of that collective attention was a physical thing. Garrett Lawson stood up. He was a cattle rancher who had arrived in Cedar Bluff 8 years ago with capital and ambition and the particular confidence of a man who had always operated within structures that protected people like him. That confidence had not survived the winter intact. He had lost cattle to the cold hired hands, to desperation, and months of sleep to the specific guilt of knowing what he knew and having chosen until this moment not to say it. When he spoke, his voice had shed its professional register, entirely leaving something plainer and more honest than anything he had offered this community. Before everything Seth said is true, Vance approached me before the first snow. He wanted Eleanor Marsh's land. He said he would do whatever it took to get it. I was at the meeting where the arrangement with the Holt brothers was discussed. I said nothing because I owed Vance money, and I was afraid of what saying something would cost me. He sat back down, and the chair received him the way chairs receive people who have just set down something heavy all at once, with visible relief. The room erupted. Reverend Whitmore did not attempt to restore order immediately, understanding that there are moments in a community's life when noise needs to run its course before silence can be productive again. He stood at the front with his hands folded and waited, and eventually the clamor organized itself back into the shape of a meeting. Seth had one more thing to say, and when Whitmore gave him the floor back, he delivered it without preamble. The boy on the ridge, Billy Crane. His voice changed register here in a way that was the only indication that not everything in Seth Holt's accounting was purely transactional. His eyes dropped to the floor. That was Conrad. He saw the children on the path and decided to take what they were carrying. When the older boy turned, Conrad panicked. He paused. I was watching from the trees. I didn't fire. I also didn't stop it. That's mine to carry. Roy Crane was in the back of the church. He had been a large man before the winter, and the winter had stripped weight from him in ways that extended beyond the physical. The grief of losing his son, having taken something from the architecture of him that no amount of spring warmth would rebuild. He pushed forward through the crowd with a sound in his chest that was not a word and not entirely a sound, something more primary than either. And four men caught him before he reached Seth, because they were not protecting Seth, but protecting Roy, because Roy Crane was not a man who needed violence added to what he was already carrying. He fought against their holds for a moment and then stopped, not because he had accepted anything, but because his legs had made a unilateral decision, and Wade Dutton and another man lowered him into a pew and stayed beside him while the room finished its business. What Cedar Bluff did with Silas Vance over the following hour was not a trial in any legal sense. There was no procedure, no representation, no mechanism of appeal, but it was not mob justice either. It was something older and more specific, the collective judgment of a community that has looked at one of its members and reached a verdict about what he is and what his continued presence among them would mean. Reverend Whitmore articulated it in the measured language he used for things he had thought carefully about. The evidence before us isn't sufficient to hang a man in a proper court. It may be sufficient in a proper court for other consequences, but we are not a proper court, and what we do here is not legal proceeding. It is community accounting. He looked at Vance directly. You purchased violence against a woman who saved the lives of our children. A 9-year-old boy is buried on that ridge because of a chain of events you initiated. We cannot try you for that here, but we can decide who we are in relation to you. Vance made one final attempt, and it was his best, calm, legally precise, appealing to the institutional framework within which he had operated for 10 years, and which had always until now protected him. I am an officer of the territorial government. What you're describing constitutes interference with a lawfully appointed. Wade Dutton's voice came from the back of the room, stripped of everything except simple statement. You tried to murder the woman who kept our children alive. I don't care what your paper from Denver says. The room agreed not with noise, but with the particular stillness of collective decision. Seth Holt was given until sunset to leave Cedar Bluff Valley. He walked out of the church and out of the territory with the clothes on his back and the negotiated assurance of his life, and no one watched him go because no one cared to. Garrett Lawson lost his ranch, the land redistributed among the families who had paid the heaviest price for a winter they had been given no honest chance to prepare for. He stayed in the valley and lived for the remaining years of his time there on the charity of people he had once looked down upon from the height of his property, and his Vance-backed credit in the humility this required of him was its own long sentence. Vance left 3 weeks later in the middle of the night, taking only what he could carry. On one horse, abandoning a house full of fine furniture, a safe full of debt instruments that were now worth nothing because the debtors had collectively decided to treat them as nothing, and a decade's worth of accumulated authority that had evaporated so completely that walking down Cedar Bluff's main street had become a daily exercise in invisibility. He had been the most powerful man in the valley for 10 years, and he left it as a ghost, not remembered, not mourned, not even satisfyingly hated, just released from relevance as a community, releases things that no longer serve any purpose, including the purpose of being despised. No one ever reported seeing him again, which may have been the most accurate accounting of what he had always actually been, a man who existed entirely in relation to what he could take from others, and who therefore ceased to exist when the taking stopped. Spring came to Cedar Bluff the way it comes to places that have earned it slowly with deliberate care, as though the season understood that what lay beneath the snow was fragile from months of compression and required gentling, rather than abrupt revelation. The ice fog lifted first the valley, emerging from its white suspension into the sharp particular air of early thaw. Then the creek found its voice again, beneath the ice, a sound that began as a suggestion and built over days into the cheerful insistence of water that has been waiting and is now impatient. The mountains shed their snow from the bottom up the lower slopes, going brown and then tentatively green, while the highest peaks held on to winter out of stubbornness or loyalty or simply because they were closer to the cold that generates it. Eleanor was already planting by the time the last of the cabin's perimeter snow had retreated to the shaded north side. She knelt in the dark soil with her hands pressed palm down against the earth, feeling the temperature of it, the density, the specific readiness that a person learns to read not with instruments but with the kind of attention that is itself a form of listening. 4 years of preparing for the worst had taught her things about the land that could not be extracted from it by any other method. And one of those things was this soil that has survived a hard winter is better soil, compacted and mineral rich, holding what it was given and ready to give it forward. She pressed seeds into it with the deliberate care of someone who understands that what she was doing was not farming, but conversation in exchange across the specific distance between effort and outcome. That is the whole terrain of human experience in a difficult world. The children who had sheltered with her returned to their families in reunions that were conducted entirely in the currency of touch, parents grabbing children and refusing to let go for longer than seemed possible, to maintain fathers weeping without attempting concealment, mothers pressing their faces into small heads and breathing in the fact of survival. Eleanor watched these reunions from the cabin doorway or from the edge of her property as families made their way down the ridge, and she felt something she had not experienced in the presence of other people's joy for a long time. Not envy, not isolation, but something warmer and more complicated, an emotion that required a kind of capacity she had been rebuilding. One small increment at a time since the first night, Clara leaned against her arm. Noah stayed. The news about his father arrived in the second week of January. Frank Cole found frozen in a drainage ditch near the south end of town, a bottle empty in his right hand, the final transaction of a man who had been spending himself down to zero for 2 years. Noah received this information with the contained expression of someone who had already performed the necessary grief, in advance distributed it across months of understanding how the story was going to end, so that when the end arrived, it confirmed rather than surprised. He stayed on the ridge because there was nothing below that held him, and because the ridge had become the place where the person he was becoming made sense. He was 17 now in calendar and considerably older in the ways that determined everything, and he moved through the work of rebuilding with the quiet authority of someone who has earned his place without needing it formalized. Clara's father came for her when the snow on the access path had softened enough to make the ascent manageable, arriving with hopeful eyes and the careful posture of a man who wants something very much and knows he may not receive it. Owen Prentice had survived the winter in town by doing whatever needed doing with the specific determination of a man whose reason for surviving is located somewhere other than himself. He had not stopped thinking about his daughter for the duration of 4 months, and walking up to the cabin door to ask for her back was either the easiest thing he had ever done or the hardest, and he would not have been able to say which. Clara looked at her father with those steady blue eyes that had not changed since the night she arrived, with nothing but herself and a willingness to work, and she said what she had already decided. "I want to stay with Mrs. Eleanor." Owen Prentice's face did something complicated in private, and he looked at Eleanor over his daughter's head with the expression of a man asking a question too important to say aloud. Eleanor met his gaze and held it, and what passed between them in that moment was the acknowledgement that Clara had already made her home, and that homes once made resist relocation in ways that have nothing to do with walls or ownership. He visited every Sunday after that, without exception, arriving on the ridge in whatever weather the morning provided, and Clara always ran to meet him on the path, and they sat together on the cabin porch for an hour every week, and the arrangement was not what he had hoped for, and was still something he would not have traded, because the alternative was a daughter who was less fully herself. Old Walt Greer stayed because the alternative was an empty room in an emptier life, and because the Valley's children needed what he had to give in a way that felt specific to this time and this place. Not nostalgia for the old schoolhouse, but the forward-looking urgency of people who have just understood the cost of ignorance in a way that cannot be unfelt. He started teaching 3 mornings a week in a cleared space on the lower slope. Children from the valley climbing the ridge with slates and the particular bright attention of students who have a reason to learn rather than merely an obligation to attend. Ruth Alderman made no announcement about staying. She simply remained working beside Eleanor each day with the steadiness of a woman who has found her correct location after a long search that she didn't know was a search until it ended. They developed between them the particular friendship of 2 people who have nothing to prove to each other, who communicate in the shorthand of shared work rather than shared words, who have accepted without discussion the specific shape that this relationship has taken and are not interested in reshaping it. Eleanor would not have called Ruth her closest friend because Eleanor had not yet fully re-inhabited the language of friendship. But she would have said that Ruth was someone she was glad to know, and at this stage of her life, that meant something considerable. 3 new cabins rose on the ridge by summer, built from timber, hauled up the slope by men who came offering labor as the only repayment they could make for what the winter had required of Eleanor. She did not refuse their help or their apologies, because both were given honestly, and she had no use for refusing honest things. The new smokehouse went up with stone walls and a tin roof, fire-resistant by design rather than by chance, and it was larger than the one that had burned, a deliberate expansion, built to accommodate not just Eleanor's household, but the function it had already demonstrated it could serve for the broader community. The root cellar was deepened and reinforced and given a second entrance. Drying racks appeared everywhere on the ridge, taller and better constructed than before, made by hands that now understood what the racks were for. The valley below followed, not all at once, not with the convert's zeal of people who have discovered something new, but with the practical determination of people who have learned a lesson through direct personal cost and have no desire to repeat the tuition. Every household built or bought a drying rack before summer's end. Every family put away salt and smoked meat and sealed jars with the new understanding that preparation was not paranoia but responsibility, the most basic form of care a person could offer their own household and, by extension, their neighbors. Eleanor taught anyone who came to the ridge to learn, sharing the knowledge she had spent 2 decades accumulating and one terrible winter proving withholding nothing, because hoarding knowledge was the one form of hoarding she had never been capable of. "We plan now," she told the children who came to learn alongside their parents, "so we don't have to beg later." That's not pessimism. It's the only honest relationship you can have with a world that doesn't make promises. Dr. Harker became a regular presence on the ridge through the spring and into summer, arriving in the early evenings with medical supplies and the news from town, and the easy companionship of a man who has found a place where he doesn't have to explain himself. He and Eleanor developed the habit of sitting on the porch after the day's work was done, watching the light shift across the mountains, with the comfortable silence of people who have moved past the stage of needing to fill time with words. They talked about medicine and weather and what they had both seen, and occasionally about what they had both lost, and the conversations about loss were different from the ones Eleanor had ever had before, because Harker was one of the rare people who could sit inside a painful subject without trying to resolve it prematurely. One evening he asked whether she had ever considered leaving, starting fresh somewhere that didn't hold the memories this ridge held. Eleanor was quiet for long enough that he might have thought the question hadn't carried. She looked out at the 4 graves behind the cabin, 3 old ones and 1 newer, smaller one, and then at Clara, working in the kitchen garden below the cabin's east wall, and then at the mountains that had watched all of it without comment or mercy or relief. "The week after I buried Caleb and the boys, I thought about walking into those mountains and letting the cold finish the job," she said. "I'm not ashamed of that. I was out of reasons." Harker waited. "What stopped me was anger. I was so furious at the winter, at God, at the whole indifferent machinery of the world, that I couldn't give it the satisfaction of winning." She paused. And then 4 years went by and something changed. It wasn't anger anymore. She watched Clara carry a small basket of weeds to the compost heap, efficient and purposeful, as always pausing to say something to Noah that made him laugh. "The only honest way to honor the ones you lose is to keep living in the direction they would have wanted for you. The only way to make their deaths mean something is to build something from them." She looked at the mountains again, ancient and immovable, and finally, in this particular moment, something other than threatening. "I'm not going anywhere. This is where I'm supposed to be." The investigator from the territorial government arrived in early September on a horse that had been ridden a long distance, carrying official documents and the slightly guarded expression of someone conducting a formal inquiry in an informal setting. He was young in a way that meant not only his age, but his experience, a man who had been given authority before being given the history that makes authority responsible. He had spoken to everyone in Cedar Bluff who was willing to speak, and the accounts he had received were so consistent in their essential facts that he had arrived at Eleanor's door not to investigate her, but to understand her, which was a different enterprise. He sat on the porch and asked his questions with genuine rather than procedural attention, and Eleanor answered each one in the plain, unelaborated way. She answered everything without self-aggrandizement and without false modesty, simply stating what had happened and what she had done about it. When he asked about a winter supply crisis, she described the landslide, the months of isolation, the specific deterioration of town resources. When he asked about Vance, she gave him the sequence of events in the order they had occurred, noting what could be directly substantiated and what was inference, making no distinction in her tone between the two, but being careful to distinguish them explicitly, because she had no interest in contributing to the world's existing surplus of dishonest testimony. When all the formal questions had been answered and he closed his notebook, he sat for a moment with the expression of someone who has received more than they came for. Then he asked the question that was not in his official brief: how did you survive it, the loss? How does a person continue functioning after something like that? He was asking about Caleb and James and Henry, and Eleanor recognized in the question the genuine curiosity of a young man who has not yet been required to answer it for himself and wants to know if there is an answer before the requirement arrives. She looked at him for a long moment. The ones who ask me that are usually looking for something they can apply in advance, she said. A technique, a formula, as if knowing the method beforehand would make the loss more survivable when it comes. She shook her head slowly. There isn't one. You just decide that giving up would mean they died for nothing. And that's not a decision you make once. It's one you make every morning for a length time until one day you realize you've stopped having to make it because it's become what you are. The young man nodded with the specific expression of someone receiving information they'll need to grow into. He thanked her with unusual sincerity for a formal inquiry. She gave him water for his horse and watched him ride back down the slope toward the town that was rebuilding itself in the valley below, and she thought about how young he was and how long the road ahead of him was, and hoped privately that he would have time to prepare. The first hard frost came in late September, 2 weeks ahead of historical average, and Eleanor noticed it without concern or adjustment. Her stores were full. The smokehouse held 3 months of preserved meat. The root cellar carried more than she had managed in the autumn before the landslide year. The community on the ridge was ready, and so was the valley below, not perfectly, not with the obsessive precision that Eleanor had applied to her own preparations, but adequately, which was a distance further than they had been 12 months ago. Oliver Whitmore, Reverend Whitmore's son, who had carried a town council letter through a blizzard months ago, and returned from the experience carrying something new in his posture, some awareness that had not been there before, climbed the ridge on a September afternoon when the aspens had begun to turn, and the air had that first faint metallic quality that precedes serious cold. He was taller than when Eleanor had last really looked at him, with the particular height of a young man whose body has made sudden decisions about its own configuration. He stood in the garden where she was kneeling and delivered the town's message with the formality of someone taking the errand seriously. Cedar Bluff intended to name the new central square in her honor. The square was being built at the site of the old trading post, the geographic heart of the valley's daily life. They wanted her to know. They wanted her to say something they could carry back. Eleanor stayed kneeling in the garden, her hands in the soil for a long moment after he finished. Oliver waited with the patience his father had modeled and he had absorbed. She turned over a dark handful of earth, examining the weight and texture of it, the particular richness of ground that has been worked and fed and given the chance to develop into something better than it started as. When she finally looked up, the question she asked was simpler than whatever official statement he had come expecting. What should they plant there? Oliver's composure cracked slightly into something younger and more genuine. They want to know that. They're asking you. What should they grow in the square? Eleanor stood and brushed the soil from her hands and looked out over the valley laid before her in the late afternoon light, fields reclaimed from the winter structures, rebuilt from ruin, smoke rising from the chimneys of households that had learned in the hardest school available what it actually meant to take care of yourself and the people around you. She looked at it without ownership and without sentimentality, with the clear assessment of someone who has spent years reading landscapes for what they can actually support rather than what you wish they could. Anything they want, she said, as long as they remember how to keep it alive. Oliver repeated this back to himself softly, as if testing whether it carried the weight he needed to transport it back down the hill. He descended the ridge looking slightly less certain about his errand than when he'd come up, but considerably more certain about things that mattered more. That evening, the last of the September light was doing what it does when it means to be, final going gold, and then amber, and then a deep saturated red at the horizon before surrendering to dark. And Eleanor sat on the porch with Clara beside her, and inside the cabin Noah was making dinner, the smell of bread baking and broth simmering, moving through the open door in alternating waves that were together indistinguishable from the smell of safety. Old Walt's voice carried from somewhere below the ridge where he had gathered a circle of children for his evening story, his tone rising and falling with the practiced drama of a man who has learned that children learn what they love first and they love what they are made to feel. Ruth moved past the window behind Eleanor, her shadow falling briefly across the porch boards, a daily familiarity that required no acknowledgement. Clara sat close, her small body a warm, specific weight against Eleanor's arm, that slight but absolute lean that had begun months ago in the cabin's firelight and had never stopped. The child looked out at the northern mountains with an expression difficult to characterize. Not fear, not the anxiety of someone searching for threat, but the alert attention of someone who has learned to watch and who understands that watching is not the same as worrying. She had learned this here on this ridge from this woman in this year, and she would carry it forward into every year that came after. Will winter come again? The question was asked with the directness that was Clara's fundamental characteristic. No prefacing, no softening, just the thing itself offered as simply as she offered everything. Eleanor looked at the high peaks that still held snow in their most protected hollows, that last resistant white against the darkening sky, the thin remainder of a winter that had tried to be permanent and had failed as all winters fail, as all permanent things fail. Because permanence is the story we tell about things that haven't changed yet, rather than things that cannot change. The mountains had no opinion. They received seasons without preference and released them without grief, and there was something in their consistency that she had once found threatening and now found, if not comforting, at least honest. It always does, she said. Clara absorbed this without visible alarm, working it into whatever internal architecture she had been quietly constructing for herself over the months of this ridge and this cabin and this woman who had become the fixed point of her compass. She asked the follow-up with the same simple directness. Will we be ready? Eleanor pulled her closer, the child's warmth against her side, both specific and general. This child and all the children, this winter, and all the winters, this survival, and every survival that had been built from loss and refusal, and the stubborn insistence that what the world takes from you does not get to determine what you do with what remains. 4 graves behind the cabin held everything she had loved first. What she had built since then had been forged specifically from the impossibility of those losses hammered into shape by grief and then by purpose, and it had become something that could not be taken because it was not property but practice, a way of being in the world that transferred itself to other people through daily demonstration and outlived the person who originated it. We will always be ready, she said. The dark came gently that evening, which September darks sometimes do, softening from amber to lavender, to the deep inhabitable black that holds stars in it rather than obscuring them. Below the ridge, Cedar Bluff lit its lamps window by window. One household at a time, the way communities reassemble themselves after disaster. Not all at once, not with ceremony, but incrementally. Each light a small, separate decision to continue. The valley had lost people this winter. It had lost structures and stores and the comfortable assumption that tomorrow would resemble today. It had lost Judge Silas Vance and the particular order he had imposed and the fear that maintained that order, and it had not yet fully decided what would replace any of those things. That work was forward into an uncertain spring and the summers after it in the winters beyond that. What it had gained, though the valley would take time to name this accurately, was the knowledge of what it was capable of. Not the comfortable civic pride of a prosperous community, but the harder, more specific knowledge of people who have been tested at the level that reveals actual character, rather than presented character. Cedar Bluff knew what it had done right and what it had done catastrophically wrong, and more importantly, it knew the difference between those two things, which is the beginning of every real form of wisdom. It knew what Eleanor Marsh had known and how she had come to know it and what knowing it had cost. Eleanor Marsh had lost the first version of her life on a December night in a blizzard that did not announce itself, And she had spent 4 years in the interval building, something from the wreckage that she had not known she was building until it was already necessary. She had made a vow over frozen ground to a silent sky, and she had kept it imperfectly and completely imperfectly because she could not keep Billy Crane alive, could not catch the bong and the bullet, and the failure of a man who should never have been given the kind of patience a loaded gun represents. Completely because she had kept it in the only way vows ever actually get kept, which is through daily recommitment to the thing you promised in the absence of any guarantee that it will be sufficient on the probability that it is better than the alternative. She had built a place where children survived. She had built a place where knowledge was exchanged freely and preparation was understood as love expressed in practical form. She had built a community from the specific material of her losses, and that community had outgrown the two-room cabin on the ridge and spread down into the valley and would continue to spread forward into the future in the ways that genuine things spread not through imposition, but through demonstration, through the simple, visible fact of what happens when a person decides that the world's cruelty is not an argument for surrender, but for preparation. The stars came out one at a time, and then all together in the way stars do when you've been watching long enough, and Eleanor Marsh sat on her porch with a child against her side, and the smell of bread through the open door, and the voices of people she had gathered and kept in the specific hard-won peace of someone who has learned that peace is not the absence of loss, but the refusal to let loss be the final word. The summer of 1888 would unfold across Cedar Bluff Valley in long golden days that would fill the drying racks and the sealed jars and the root cellars of every household that had learned what a winter could ask. Eleanor's garden would grow. Her smokehouse would fill by steady increments through August and into September. Travelers passing through the valley would carry stories of the ridge and the woman who ran it, and some of those stories would be accurate and some of them would be myth. And Eleanor would not distinguish between the two, because what mattered was not the story, but the behavior the story produced. Not the legend, but the prepared household. The legend convinced someone to maintain. Winter would come again. It always did. And when it came, Cedar Bluff would be ready, not because a woman on a ridge had saved them once, but because they had finally understood what she had been trying to tell them all along. That readiness was not a response to danger, but a relationship with it, sustained and practiced and renewed in every season of plenty against every season of need, and that the only honest promise any person can make to the people they love is not that the hard thing won't come, but that when it does, they will not be caught without a fire already burning.